It is a pleasure for me to present this webinar named Corporalidad of Emotions. How we experience emotions, how our body and brain reacts to the emotions, and how our posture can affect or modify brain activity and trigger emotions is an active research field. Today, we will listen to 3 presentations by experts from different parts of the world, and then we'll have a group discussion and Q&A. This seminar was organized by Dr. Juan Pablo Kalawski and the Science Communication Center at Universidad Autónoma de Chile. Our first speaker is Dr. Heini Saarimäki. She received her PhD in cognitive neuroscience from Aalto University in Finland in 2018 and then joined the University of Tampere in Finland as a postdoctoral researcher. In 2019 and 2020, she works as a visiting postdoctoral fellow at the California Institute of Technology. Her research interests are in the field of social and affective neuroscience, focusing on the neural basis of human emotions. She studies the neural basis of different emotions and the relationship to subjective experiences, as well as the flow of emotions during natural interaction. In her research, she combines naturalistic stimuli, such as movies and narratives, brain imaging, primarily functional MRIs, and pattern classification methods with self-reports and other subjective experiences measures.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to join the webinar. My name is Heini Saarimäki, and I'm an Academy of Finland postdoctoral fellow at Tampere University, Finland. My research focuses on the neural basis of human emotions and emotional experiences. Now I will start my presentation titled Decoding Emotions in the Body, Brain, and Mind. Hi everyone, my name is Heini Saarimäki and I'm from Tampere University, Finland. I'm very happy to participate in the webinar. My research combines brain imaging, psychophysiological measurements, and verbal self-reports to study human emotions. Today, I will talk to you about decoding emotions in the body, brain, and mind. Emotions play an important role as part of our social interaction and everyday life. Probably we all have our folk psychological understanding of what both emotion and different emotion words, such as fear, anger, love, and happiness mean. The word emotion and words describing different emotional states are widely used in our everyday language. This is why the field of emotion research has also struggled in defining what an emotion is. How can we use such everyday terms in objective research without letting our layperson understanding to guide the research? My perspective to emotions is their biological role. The biological meaning of emotions is to guarantee our survival by guiding the functioning of our mind and body to answer to the constantly changing challenges posed by the environment. They select the most important sensory information at a given moment. They also control our brain's limited processing capacity and target it to the task that is most important for our survival. For instance, when we perceive a threat in our surroundings, all our senses are tuned into observing the cause of the threat. Our muscles get tense, and we prepare to act. On the other hand, in situations where we are relaxed and there is no direct threat to our survival, resources are released to investigate the environment and to, for instance, learn new things. I define emotional state as the orchestrated changes in our mind, body, and brain that span all other cognitive functions and that together produce behavior that we can observe from the outside and assign to a specific emotion. Emotion experience is the part of the emotion that we can consciously access and experience. It is oftentimes called feeling. This is also the focus of my research. The field of emotions has lots of competing theories that don't agree on a lot of things. They all define emotions in a different way. But most emotion theories suggest that emotions comprise of multiple components, for instance, somatic, cognitive, motivational, and behavioral components. I find the component process model of emotions as an illustrative framework for how different aspects of emotions might interact during the processing of emotions. First, the emotion process is elicited when an external or internal stimulus is combined with our personal evaluation processes. For instance, our prior beliefs, values, or experiences with the stimulus. This evaluation triggers a cascade of changes in different components. For instance, actions, bodily or physiological changes, behavior, cognition, motor expression. These changes together are integrated and interpreted as a conscious emotional experience, which we can then label as, for instance, fear. The starting point for my research are the specific emotion categories that we use to describe our emotional state. As you noticed, I start at the very end of the emotion process. My research aims at decoding the underlying components or building blocks of different emotion categories. Emotions form categories at various levels. Different emotions have been associated with distinct facial expression patterns and with different types of bodily activation patterns. Further, some emotions tend to feel more similar to each other. For instance, happiness feels closer to love than to fear. Next, I will highlight recent findings from my research that demonstrate the role of bodily changes in our emotional experiences. One line of my research investigates the different emotion components and individual variation in what kind of bodily changes people report in association with different emotions. Previous research has shown that different emotions are associated with different activity patterns in the body. The Finnish researcher Lauri Nummenmaa and his colleagues showed the bodily maps of emotions depicted here. They asked people to color the body regions that either activate or deactivate for each emotion. So red color denotes activation of that body part and blue color denotes deactivation. And these are average maps across thousands of participants. But what is it that people actually feel when they report increased activity? For instance, the red color, the increased activity, could be related to felt changes in temperature, specific actions such as fists clenching, increased heart rate, tingling, and so forth. Also, we can compare the similarities between emotions. For instance, take two emotions that have seemingly similar body activation maps. Here, anger and pride both have activity, especially in the upper body and head. Anger is considered a strong negative emotion, but pride is a positive one. If you just see these maps, you would think that their bodily responses are quite similar. But do their bodily activations differ qualitatively? To investigate this, we asked people to write verbal descriptions of their emotional experiences related to different emotion categories. Among other things, we asked them to verbally report the bodily changes they felt. From these descriptions, we could extract the bodily changes associated with different emotions to a detail that this coloring study doesn't allow. The first thing that we noticed from our data is that people use different features to describe the changes in the body. In the verbal descriptions, we often see descriptions depicting changes in muscle tension, movements, sensations, actions, posture, activity, and autonomic nervous system activation such as heart rate and respiration. We can now directly compare how people describe their experiences of anger and pride. Anger is associated with tense muscles, whereas pride is associated with more relaxed muscles. Also, the movement patterns associated differ from each other. Anger is related to rigid and strong movements, whereas pride is described with determined or light movements. Also, their sensations differ. Heat, pressure, and shuddering have been described with anger, whereas warmth, lightness, and bubbling sensations have been associated with pride. From actions, for anger, the voice is yelling, we see face wrinkling, and upper body and arms clenching and hitting. Whereas for pride, the voice is talking, the face is smiling, and the arms are hugging and touching. The posture also differs. For anger, the posture is described as expanded, forward-leaning, and facing the other person. Whereas the posture in pride is also expanded and upright, a good posture. Activity for anger is described to increase, whereas for pride it is decreasing, which means that you're calming down. Also, interestingly, when reporting anger, people tend to emphasize changes in autonomic nervous system, such as faster and stronger heart rate and faster respiration patterns. However, when describing pride, people don't usually report feeling autonomic nervous system changes. This can mean that there are either no changes or people do not seem to pay attention to them during episodes of pride. We can also extract descriptions of changes in specific body parts, because in these verbal narratives, people tend to describe specific changes in specific body parts. This allows us to investigate what the body activation maps actually include. So here you see a comparison between anger and pride. For instance, the feelings in head for anger are described as having steam, heat, stinging feeling, or blood rush, whereas for pride, the descriptions of head usually just describe the posture of the head with chin lifted up. The face for anger is described as being tense, heavy, wrinkling, blushing, and feeling pressure. Whereas for pride, face is described as smiling, relaxed, chin lifted up, and maybe including tears of joy. Anger also includes pressure in throat and chest. And in chest, people also describe feeling warmth and strong heartbeat. The feelings in chest described with pride include lightness, bubbling feeling, the chest leaning forward, and calmness. Also, with pride, you can see descriptions of arms including warmth and lifting movement, whereas for anger, the arms are folded, shaking, or hitting. Anger also includes descriptions in shoulders, including tense muscles, and in stomach, stinging, heavy, and pressure feelings. And feet are usually described with stomping movement. So, after seeing the descriptions of what people actually mean when they color the activation increasing in the specific body parts, we can actually see there are quite a lot of differences in quality of these descriptions between the two emotions here. Using this data, we can also investigate the differences between emotions in how bodily changes are being reported. Do some emotions maybe have stronger bodily components? If so, maybe we could see differences in the amount of bodily changes reported for each emotion. For instance, sometimes it's mentioned that disgust has a strong bodily component compared to other emotions. So maybe descriptions of disgust contain more bodily features than those of other emotions. What you see in the figure here are the average number of features that are mentioned in one description of an emotion. And you also see the specific features, feature structure within each emotion. Based on this data, it doesn't seem to be so that disgust is an emotion with most bodily references. In fact, it seems that anger and love are associated with highest numbers of bodily features. So quantity alone doesn't seem to explain why disgust is considered such a bodily emotion. Maybe this depends on either the quality or strength of the changes experienced. This is something I cannot extract from the data. Another interesting aspect of emotions is their similarity. And we can also explore this using the verbal descriptions we have collected. We know from previous research that emotions tend to cluster together. Some emotions feel more similar to each other while some feel more distant. Could this similarity be explained by similar bodily changes? We took all the bodily features associated with each emotion and calculated the similarity of emotions using the correlation of features. Yeah, and here are the results. Blue color denotes here more similarity, with larger squares denoting also more similarity. We can identify clusters of emotions based on these data. Interestingly, it seems that so-called positive or pleasant emotions seem to cluster together, depicted here on red, while negative or unpleasant emotions are largely clustered together, depicted here in blue. Usually, the positive and negative clusters of emotions are defined by the experienced similarity. But based on these data, the pleasantness of an emotion seems to highly reflect the pleasantness of bodily experiences. We can also investigate what underlies these changes. So what makes a bodily feature pleasant or unpleasant? When comparing the emotion features between positive and negative emotions, we can identify the bodily features that are responsible for the similarities. So the positive and negative emotions seem to be differently related to muscle tone. Usually negative emotions are related to tense muscle tone and positive emotions to a relaxed tone. Also, their activity differs. Positive emotions are calm, whereas negative emotions are associated with restless activity. Also, the velocity differs, so that movements associated with negative emotions are described as rapid. And also, positive emotions are associated with feeling warmth. So based on the results so far, we can conclude that different emotions are associated with distinct bodily changes, and that the similarity of bodily feelings might underlie experienced similarity of emotions. Next, we will explore how the bodily changes show in brain activity. So what can brain imaging tell us about the relationship between bodily changes and emotional experiences? Brain imaging provides a more objective measure of representations that activate during emotional processing. Self-reports such as the verbal descriptions I introduced before are not always accessible to the person, and there is large variation in how well we can report our bodily sensations. Thus, by looking at the brain activity, we can identify the processing of bodily information regardless of whether we have conscious access to this knowledge. Brain activity can be studied in humans, for instance, using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. It is a widely used brain imaging method that measures changes in blood flow that reflect changes in neuronal activity. During fMRI scanning, the person lies still in a narrow tube, but we can present, for instance, movies or auditory stories to elicit strong emotions. We know from previous research that there are brain regions that process body-specific information. For instance, specific regions represent our bodily sensations, and a set of different regions activates during motor processing. Using this information, we can next look at the brain during processing of different emotional states and see whether the regions responsible for somatic and motor processing are also activated. In our studies, we have used a decoding approach to look at the basic and social emotions and their neural activation patterns. We figured that if different emotions have distinct brain activity patterns, we should be able to read or classify the ongoing emotional state just by looking at the brain activity. The classifier logic is simple. First, we elicit emotions using different stimuli such as movies. The stimuli come from a priori defined categories. We then train our classifier algorithm by telling it that this is how the brain looks like when it sees a disgusting movie, this is how it looks like when it sees a happy movie, and so forth. We show several exemplars per category. Next, we take new brain imaging data and test the classifier. Now we show just the brain activity pattern to the classifier, and the classifier guesses which category it belongs to. The classifier performance is evaluated based on the number of correct guesses it reaches. If the classifier performs above chance level, we know that the brain activity pattern contains some category-specific information. In these studies, we have shown that we can reliably classify emotions from each other just based on their brain activity patterns. The classification is above chance level, depicted here with the dashed line, for almost all emotional states. And this applies to both so-called basic emotions and also to more social emotions. So it seems that emotions differ from each other based on their fine-grained brain activity patterns. We can next investigate where in the brain these differences take place. Different emotions are related to widespread activity changes across the brain. There is no single brain region that would represent one emotion. Rather, emotions evoke activity in overlapping brain regions. When an emotional state is activated, a number of automatic changes take place in split seconds. Changes in facial expressions and voice, in motor actions, in autonomic nervous system activity, including heart rate and respiration, and other functions of the body, in systems controlling the behavior, in activating memories and expectations, and in the interpretation of our current state and that of the environment. Brain mechanisms underlying all these components of the mind and body are activated in an emotion-specific way, leading to emotion-related changes in the state of the central nervous system. When looking at the specific regions that activate during the processing of emotions, we notice that somatomotor regions, highlighted here in yellow, that process information regarding our bodily sensations and actions routinely activate during various emotional states. This might be evidence for the importance of bodily changes as part of generating the emotion. A closer look at the specific brain regions coding the representation of different emotions reveals that different emotions are coded in the somatomotor regions to a different extent. Here, somatomotor regions are again highlighted in yellow. And it seems that some emotions have stronger somatomotor components. For instance, love and sadness and despair and surprise seem to be particularly well represented in somatomotor regions. However, we see large differences between emotions in the representation accuracy depicted here. So somatomotor regions alone do not distinguish between all emotions. This might be because some emotions have more similar somatomotor activity patterns. Whole brain activity distinguishes emotions better, possibly because it integrates information across different components, the bodily component being only one of them. We can also explore how similar two emotions are to each other, based on either their neural activity or the reported similarity of feelings. Here we took the neural activity as the confusions that the classifier makes. So if two emotional states are very similar to each other, the classifier tends to confuse them to each other. We also asked people to rate how similar two emotional states feel to each other, and noticed that emotions that feel more similar also have more similar neural bases. So conclusions from these brain imaging studies. Automatic activation of bodily representation seems to happen during emotional experiences. But the importance of bodily representation varies between emotion categories. The more similar two emotions feel, the more similar neural bases they also have. So far, we've focused on body-related activation as part of our emotional experiences. Another interesting question regarding the relationship between bodily changes and emotions is related to the neural basis of experience and perceived emotions. Previous studies have shown interesting results suggesting that when we see someone experiencing an emotion, we activate similar representations in our own brain. This suggests that in order to understand somebody else's experience, we simulate the same experience in our brain. The so-called embodied simulation model proposes that especially sensory motor or bodily simulation of seen emotions supports their recognition by eliciting a partial somatosensory and motor representation of the emotion in the observer. In a recent study, we asked participants to both display and observe facial expressions of emotions while their brain activity was being scanned with fMRI. So we presented for them during the fMRI scanning both videos of people making different emotional expressions. And we also asked the participants during the fMRI scanning to display these similar facial expressions. And this is a recording from during the fMRI scanning. When looking at the brain maps, we showed that the brain responses both for displaying and observing facial expressions overlapped with each other. And this is again true, especially in the somatomotor brain regions. So these regions are activated both when we see somebody making a facial expression and when we are displaying the same facial expression ourselves. Especially, we wanted to know whether we can classify the specific facial expressions related to joy, disgust, and fear using cross-modal classification. This means that we train our classifier with the brain activity related to displayed emotions and test with the brain activity related to perceived emotions and do the same on the other way around. Our results showed that this was indeed possible and that the motor and somatosensory cortices were among the areas that had highest classification accuracies for the cross-modal classification. This suggests that the bodily representations between displayed and perceived emotions were similar. In another study, we investigated the brain activity during social interaction. We asked some participants to tell emotional stories from their own life while we scanned their brains with fMRI. We recorded the stories and presented them to other participants during fMRI. Speakers and listeners' brain activity was compared with intersubject synchronization, which measures how well the brain responses align in time in two or more individuals. This way, we can compare the brain activity during the stories for both speakers and listeners. It can be used to investigate whether the brain activity in same brain regions corresponds to each other in two individuals. We also asked the participants to rate the emotional experiences that the stories evoked, especially how valence, how pleasant or unpleasant they felt, and arousal, how calm or excited they felt. Of these measures, especially emotional arousal has been linked to activity in brain areas processing bodily information. And indeed, also these results show that when experienced arousal increases, speakers and listeners' brain activity aligns, for instance, in somatosensory cortices, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor regions associated with somatosensory processing. These regions are again here highlighted in yellow. Also, activity in attention-related areas aligns when arousal increases. This suggests that these regions participate in processing arousal in the stories. And for the somatomotor regions, again, these results support the embodied emotion model. So listening to the stories evoked similar bodily representations than telling the stories, suggesting that in order to understand the content, the listeners simulate the bodily and other emotional representations that the speakers have when telling the stories. However, bodily representations are not the only representations aligning, but also other emotion processing related brain areas align their activation. So, what can we take home from the studies we have seen so far? First, we have shown that different emotion categories are associated with different bodily changes. Also, bodily valence has importance for the representation of experienced valence. So maybe the pleasantness, unpleasantness dimension that we can experience is at least partly explained by the pleasantness of the bodily sensations related to these emotional experiences. Also, we have shown that bodily changes are part of the neural representation of emotions, and that bodily simulation takes place during emotion perception and experience. Open questions then remain for future, for instance, regarding the causal role of bodily changes for emotions. If we look at the component process model here, we see lots of arrows which are sort of tentative causal structure between the different components that are activated during emotions. From the brain imaging studies so far, yes, we can see that different emotions are underlined by different activity patterns in different components. But the temporal resolution of the brain imaging studies we have seen so far doesn't allow us to make inferences regarding the causal relationships, that is the arrows here in the model, between the components. Also, we don't know the exact direct correspondence between emotions and specific experienced bodily and neural changes. So we can infer that we see activation patterns, for instance, in the somatomotor regions, but we are not completely sure whether these directly reflect the experienced somatomotor changes that are associated to this specific emotion, and this remains to be investigated. I will finish my presentation by leaving the contributions up here, and I very much look forward to continuing the discussion in the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saarimäki, for a very interesting talk. Now, please receive our second speaker, Dr. Tal Shafir. She is Doctor in Motor Control from the School of Kinesiology at the University of Michigan. She was a postdoctoral fellow in infant brain behavior interactions and neuroscience of emotions at the University of Michigan. She's interested in interdisciplinary research on movement-emotion interaction and its underlying brain mechanism, behavioral expressions, and therapeutic applications. This research is the subject of his TEDx talk, How Your Body Affects Your Happiness, and other several articles. Over the past few years, Dr. Shafir has studied Laban, Bartnenieff movement analysis, and the Anat Vaniel method, neuromovement. She was senior editor at the Academic Journal of Creative Arts Therapies and senior editor of the research topic Frontiers in Psychology, the state-of-the-art in creative arts therapies, and serves on research committee of the American Dance Therapy Association. She is currently a professor at the Academic College Society and the Arts and Research Fellow at the University of Haifa, Israel. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Shafir.
Hello. I would like to thank Dr. Kalawski for inviting me to participate in this webinar about embodiment of emotions. I'm Dr. Tal Shafir, and in my presentation titled Neurophysiological Mechanisms Underlying Movement-Emotion Interaction, I will talk about the hypothesized brain mechanisms underlying the interaction between bodily movements and emotions, and the research I conducted whose purpose was to confirm and demonstrate this hypothesis. Hello, I'm Dr. Tal Shafir, and I'm a dance movement therapist and a neuroscientist. In dance movement therapy, clients use their bodily movements to both express their emotions and examine, explore, process, and gradually change their emotions. The therapist understands the client's emotional state from looking at the client's movements and gives the client general suggestions regarding how to move in order for the client to express and process their emotions through movement. This use of movement is based on the idea of an internal bidirectional connection between movement and emotions, where movements affect our emotional state, and our emotional state affects how we move. Dance movement therapy was originally based on psychological theories, but as a neuroscientist, I wanted to understand also the biological mechanism as underlying dance movement therapy, and this is what motivated me to do my research. In this presentation, I will talk about the hypothesized neurophysiological mechanisms underlying the interaction between bodily movements and emotion, and the research I conducted whose purpose was to confirm and demonstrate these hypotheses. Emotion has been defined in many different ways during history and in different fields of study. And even today, within the field of emotion science, researchers do not agree about its definition. Therefore, in order to put my presentation in the correct context, I will start by the definition of emotion that I use for the purpose of my studies. Based on this definition, I will then talk about the hypothesized biological mechanism for the bidirectional interaction between movement and emotion. This hypothesized mechanism is based on the assumption that there are associations in our brain between certain movement characteristics and specific emotions, and I will describe the different experiments I conducted in order to explore and demonstrate these associations during emotion elicitation through movement, during emotion expression through movement, and during emotion recognition from movement. The way I relate to emotion is similar to the James Lang theory of emotion, which postulates that bodily responses to stimuli are necessary for emotional experience, and therefore feelings are not the causes of autonomic nervous system activation and emotional behavior, but rather are the consequences of them. James summarized this idea nicely when he wrote that we feel angry because we strike and afraid because we tremble, and not that we strike or tremble because we are angry or fearful. In recent years, this theory was further developed and supported with biological evidence by Antonio Damasio. According to Damasio, the current state of the body is conveyed to the brain through the process of interoception, which is input from the body to the brain about mechanical, thermal, chemical, metabolic, and hormonal status of all tissues of the body, and through proprioception, which is input from the body to the brain about changes in muscle length and angles of the different joints. Any change in the body state and any other stimulus, whether external, such as a visual image or a sound, or internal, such as a memory or a thought, activates in the brain what Damasio calls an action program, which initiates a set of physiological responses in the body aimed at addressing the detected change or stimulus in a way that will maintain or restore homeostatic balance and keep us alive. This set of physiological responses are activated automatically, involuntarily, and unconsciously, and they include activation of the autonomic nervous system and internal organs, activation of facial and bodily muscles, of body endocrine and peptide system, and of neurotransmitter nuclei in the brain. So, for example, I once hiked in the forest and suddenly noticed the grass moving near the path to my right, and before I knew what's going on, something small quickly crossed the path just where I was going to put my foot in the next step. My foot was already in the air when I noticed it, and this visual stimulus caused me to automatically hold my foot in the air a bit longer and make my next step bigger in order not to step on it. At the same time, my sympathetic nervous system kicked in, my heart rate went up, and I became very alert. I looked to my left to see what was it that crossed my path and saw a poisonous snake moving away. All these muscular and autonomic nervous system responses happened quickly and automatically, and only after the snake was already far, I became conscious of my fear. The response actions, according to Damasio, are activated automatically by the brain, based on either innate or acquired what he calls dispositional knowledge, which is stored in higher order cortices and in some subcortical nuclei. Some of this dispositional knowledge is innate, and some is acquired based on past personal experience of how certain situations were paired with specific emotional responses. These activated physiological response actions following the input to the brain are subsequently signaled through interoception and proprioception back to the brain, to limbic and somatosensory regions, and can either remain unconscious or become conscious. The set of physiological response actions triggered by the stimulus and the unconscious detection of the brain of the resultant changes in the body state were defined by Damasio as emotions. And different emotions, according to Damasio, are represented in the brain by unique and different neural activation patterns which guide behavior and influence decisions and correlate with the subjective feelings of those emotions. Damasio differentiated between emotions and feelings and defined feelings as the subjective conscious experience of the representations in the brain of these changes in body state, or in other words, the feelings are our conscious experience of unconscious emotions which elicited them. So in the case of the encounter with the snake, the automatic response of changing my steps and the increase in the heart rate and the detection by the brain that this is what happened in my body is the emotion, which was then translated into conscious feeling of fear. In this case, the dispositional knowledge that caused those specific responses, which prevented me from being bitten by the snake, was probably innate, as we know that many animals automatically are afraid of snakes. An example for an acquired dispositional knowledge can be the activation of the sympathetic nervous system in veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder in response to a sound of an airplane as a result of their past experience of hearing airplane sound during the war while being bombarded. In relation to bodily movement and its perceptive input to the brain, the innate dispositional knowledge, which is what I call the internal associations between movement and emotions, are probably those that we share with other species, such as associations between freezing or condensing and shrinking of the body with the emotion of fear, or the association between expanding the body and the feeling of having power and dominance. In addition, we have also some acquired associations, which were probably learned from repetitive experience through the process of Hebbian learning. An example to that might be the association in Western culture between nodding of the head in the vertical direction and the word or the concept of yes. The implication of this proposition by Damasio is the ability to regulate and change one's emotion and feelings by changing the interoceptive and proprioceptive input to the brain through voluntary changes in our motor behavior. This process of changing the emotional state through movement is basically what happens during dance movement therapy, and this was the process that I wanted to investigate. But as I said before, the interaction between movement and emotion is bidirectional, and movement not only affects emotions, but is also affected by emotions. Different emotions are expressed through the body by different movements, and one can recognize another's emotions based on their movements. What is the biological mechanism underlying this ability? Recognizing the emotion of others from their movement is based on activation of the mirror neurons in the brain. The mirror neurons, whose main location in the brain is marked in the picture in yellow and red, were discovered by Rizzolatti in the 1990s. Rizzolatti studied motor control by implementing electrodes in monkeys' brain and researching the electrodes' pattern of activation when the monkeys reached and grasped pieces of apple using different hand trajectories. One day, the experimenter entered to the room eating an apple, and when the monkey saw him, the electrodes in his brain were activated even though the monkey didn't move his arm. This led to the discovery of the mirror neurons and the fact that they are activated very similarly during motor execution, motor observation, and motor imagery of the same movements. Researchers claim that during motor observation and motor imagination, the mirror neurons simulate the brain activation during motor execution of the same movements. And that this simulation is actually the base for our ability, when we observe other people's movement, to feel and therefore to recognize what these people feel, or in other words, to feel empathy towards them. Therefore, in my first study, I aim to demonstrate that motor execution, motor observation, and motor imagination of emotional movements will enhance their associated feelings, and that these associations between certain movements and specific emotions will be reflected in different brain activation patterns when observing movements that express different emotions. In this study, I took short video clips of actors expressing through movement happiness, sadness, fear, and neutral emotions. The faces of the actors in these clips were covered so that their emotions could be recognized only from their movements. These video clips were created and validated by Atkinson as expressing those emotions. Atkinson created 10 different clips for each of these emotions, and I took the 2 clips, one performed by a male actor and one performed by a female actor, in which the emotion were correctly recognized by most people, and taught the participant in my study to move the movement sequences that were in those clips. I noticed that males tend to express emotions slightly different from females, so I taught my male participants the movements from a clip performed by a male actor, and the female participants the movements performed by a female actor. When teaching them the movements, I didn't tell the participants that the movements were supposed to express emotions, and I didn't use any emotion words. In fact, to disguise the exact purpose of the study, we told them that the purpose of the study was to investigate the effects on the brain of doing, observing, and imagining movements. And in addition to asking them to rate their emotions, we gave them a memory test and measured how tired they became after each task. I asked my participants first to move the movements I taught them from each clip several times in a row, and to rate their feelings before and after they moved using the PANAS questionnaire, in which they were presented with a list of emotions and were asked to rate how strongly they feel each of these emotions, and using a visual analog scale for several different emotions, which basically means marking on a line for each emotion the intensity of their feelings of that emotion between 0 on the left side of the line and maximum at the right side of the line. Then I asked them to imagine themselves moving those movements several times in a row, and then to watch several times in a row the 10 clips that express each emotion. The participants were asked to rate their emotion and fatigue and to do a memory test before and after each of these tasks. Then we measured the differences in the score of how much they felt each emotion after compared to before doing, imagining, or observing the movements that express each emotion. Here is an example of how it looked. On the left, you can see the original Atkinson clip, and on the right side, you can see one of the participants in my study doing the same motor sequence. In this example, the participant executed the sequence of happy movements. I'll show it again. This clip shows execution of fear movements. Sad movement. I'm sorry, that was fear again. Sad movement. And neutral movements, in this case, knocking on the door. The figure represents the results of the changes in emotional rating following execution, observation, and imagination of the happy, sad, and fearful movements. This is a complicated figure, so I will not get into it in details, but summarize and say that doing the emotional movements had a stronger effect on the participants' feelings than observing or imagining the emotional movements. As for the effect of the different types of movements, we found that doing happy movements significantly increased positive emotions and decreased negative emotions. Observing and imagining happy movements didn't have any significant effect, probably because these mentally mentally healthy participants probably were quite happy to begin with, and the weaker effect of observation and imagination compared to the effect of movement execution was not strong enough to make them feel even happier. Doing, observing, and imagining sad movements significantly increased sadness and reduced positive emotions. Doing fearful movements significantly increased negative emotions and reduced some positive emotions, and observing and imagining fearful movements significantly increased feeling of fear. So in general, one could say that doing, observing, and imagining emotional movements enhance the emotion associated with those movements. In addition to the behavioral experiment, we also showed the participant Atkinson clips while scanning their brain using MRI in order to check where can one see activation that might indicate something about the association between the specific movement and their associated emotions and feelings. Here you can see the same brain slices while observing clips of movements expressing different emotions. The upper row shows brain activation while observing happy movements. The middle row when observing fearful movements, and the lower row shows brain activation while observing sad movements. Observing different emotional movements created brain activation patterns that were partially similar to all emotions in regions related to the general process of translating visual input of movement into emotions. We can see those in the thalamus, here, here, and here. In the insula, in both sides of the brain, here and here for the happy movements, here and here the fear movements, and here in the sad movements. In the cerebellum, here, here, and here. And occipital gyrus in both sides of the brain, here and here, here and here, and here and here. In addition, there were activations in areas that were different for observing different emotional movements, supporting the idea that different movements would induce different emotions. Moreover, these activation patterns corresponded with what we know about the brain. Observation of only the happy movements created activation in the ventral striatum, which you can see here. This doesn't exist in the fear movements or the sad movements. And we know that the ventral striatum is responsible for reward and motivation, and happiness is a rewarding emotion. Only observation of fear movement significantly activated the parietal cortex here, and a much larger area in the motor cortex compared to that activated by observation of happy and sad movements. Here, the motor cortex, and here is much more than here and here. The parietal cortex has a role in orientation in space, and together with increased activation in the motor cortex, this activation pattern was probably related to preparing oneself for fight or flight, when one needs to figure out where in space is the source of danger and to which direction should one run away. Lastly, observing the sad movements resulted with overall very low brain activation, as you can see here, consistent with the unresponsiveness, passivity, and inactivity that often accompany being sad. To summarize, in this study, I demonstrated that motor observation of happy, sad, and fearful movements differentially activated emotional processing regions in the brain, and that motor execution, motor observation, and motor imagination of emotional movements enhanced the subjective affective state in the corresponding direction. We know, however, that different people express emotions in slightly different ways, which do not always include the exact same movements that I used in my experiment to elicit those emotions. Yet, it is obvious that which emotions they express. This notion led me to hypothesize that it is not specific movements, but specific movement characteristics that are associated in our brain with specific emotions. And as long as a movement contains the movement characteristics that are associated with a specific emotion, it will enhance that emotion and will be perceived as expressing that emotion. Therefore, the aim of my second study was to test this hypothesis and to find which movement characteristics are associated with which of the four basic emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and happiness. To do that, I decided to use Laban-Bartenieff movement analysis for characterizing the movements. I use this method because it is the most comprehensive existed system for analyzing movement, because it is used in many different fields, from dance to computer science, and with various applications from choreography to research and therapy, because it uses language that everybody can easily understand, and because it has a system of writing and reading movement. Laban-Bartenieff movement analysis describes 4 major motor components of movement: body, effort, shape, and space, each with a subset of motor elements. Body means which body segment participate in the movement and the coordination. It also includes some well-known body actions such as walking or sitting. Effort represents the person's attitude towards movement. It describes the dynamic qualitative variables of movement and how they change over time. It includes 4 major components: the weight, which represents the amount of force involved in the movement and can be strong, light, or passive when no force is activated during the movement. Space, which represents attention and the attitude towards a chosen pathway and can be direct or indirect. Time is the degree of acceleration or deceleration, and any movement can be either sudden or sustained. Lastly, the flow represents the degree to which a movement is controlled, and each movement can have free or bound flow. The third Laban major motor component has to do with the shape of the body, or the way the body sculpts itself in space. The body's shape can expand or condense in all directions at once. It can rise or sink in the vertical direction, spread or enclose in the horizontal direction, and advance or retreat in the sagittal direction. The fourth major motor component is space, which indicates where the movement goes in space and can be up or down, side open or side cross, and forward or back. In addition, we also looked at in our study at the phrasing of movements, which is a Laban term that describes the change in the intensity of the movement over time, and similar to musical phrases, can be increasing, decreasing, or rhythmic. So in the next experiment, first, for each emotion, we identified the Laban motor elements that appeared in all of Atkinson's clips of that emotion. We then created from these elements motifs, which are written instructions for movement similar to scores of music. Each motif included a combination of elements of the same emotion. You can see example of these motifs down here. We then asked Laban experts to read the motifs, move them for a few minutes, and rate what emotion they felt as a result of the movement. Because the instructions that we gave were written and included only motor elements, as opposed to showing them specific movements through videos, each of the Laban experts could execute the motif by doing their own specific movements, which were different from person to person, even though they all included the same motor elements that we instructed them to move. To clarify this point, I will give an example. The combination of the 3 Laban motor elements, strong, direct, and sudden, can be moved as a kick with the leg or as a punch with the arm. These are 2 completely different movements, but they both include the motor characteristic of moving fast and with a lot of force directed at a specific point in space. 80 different experts participated in the study, and altogether we had results from 1,241 executed motifs. Using statistical analysis, we predicted which motor elements, when moved, enhanced which emotion. Our statistical analysis indicated that the following motor elements predicted feeling the following emotions. Anger was elicited by movements which included the Laban motor elements of strong, sudden, advance, or direct. Retreating, condensing, bound movements, moving backward, and enclosing elicited a feeling of fear. Passive heavy movements, bringing the arms to touch the upper body, to touch the chest area, shoulders, head, or face. Sinking in the torso and dropping the head elicited sadness. And happiness was elicited by jumping, rhythmicity, spreading, free, light, upward, and rising movement. The feeling of each emotion was predicted by a unique set of motor elements, and each motor element predicted only one emotion. In sum, this experiment confirmed the notion that affect could be changed by moving with specific movement characteristics and identified the movement characteristics that enhance each basic emotion. To strengthen the idea of association in the brain between certain movement characteristics and specific emotions, I wanted to show that the motor characteristics that moving them enhance a certain emotion are the same motor characteristics found in movements that express that emotion. To do that, we ask subjects to recall a happy life event, to write in a short paragraph what happened during that event, to tell it to the experimenter, and then to move the same way as they moved during that event, or to express in movement what they felt in that event, or what they feel now when they recall that event. Then they were asked to rate the intensity of their emotions while they moved. This procedure was then repeated with recalling a sad life event. We filmed the participants during this entire process, and certified Laban experts coded the motor elements that appeared in their movements. We then measured which motor elements were most frequent in the movements that express happiness, and which were most frequent in the movements that express sadness. The results showed that the happiness expressions were characterized by the same Laban motor elements as the ones we found in our previous experiment, plus the additional motor element of rotation. The sadness expressions were also characterized by the same Laban motor elements that were found in our previous experiment, plus the additional motor element of small personal kinesphere, which basically means moving movements which are small. The findings of additional characteristics associated with each of the emotions can be explained by the fact that this study was based on movements of 60 different people, while Atkinson clips from which we extracted the original motor elements were based on the movements of only a handful of actors, and it is possible that these few actors didn't use in their movement all of the emotional movement characteristics which exist for each emotion. We also found positive correlation between emotional intensity and the frequency of appearance of the associated motor elements, as well as some gender differences, which I will not get into because of time limitation. To further strengthen the claim for association in the brain between certain movement characteristics and specific emotions, we also wanted to demonstrate that when people observe movements which include those movement characteristics, they recognize the movements as expressing the associated emotion. In order to do that, we created 113 3-second clips, each of which depicted a Laban expert performing a combination of 2 to 4 motor elements which are associated with a certain emotion. We blurred the faces of the movers in those clips to avoid any indication for their emotional state through facial expression, and in our next experiment, we asked participants to observe these clips and indicate which emotion they perceive from the movements they observed. Note that the Laban experts who moved these combinations of motor elements were not asked to express emotions, but just to move movements which include various combinations of motor elements. They were not told what was the purpose of the study, nor were they told about the results of our previous experiment or the hypothesized association between the motor elements they were asked to move and emotions. Sorry. To give you an idea of how did the movement composed of the Laban element combination look like, here are a few examples. This one is a combination of anger characteristics. I'll show it again. This movement is composed of fear characteristics. This movement was composed from the sad characteristics, and this one was composed of happy characteristics. This graph represents the results of this last experiment. For each emotion, you can see the percentage of recognition of the expected emotion from the clips of movements composed of different motor elements. The blue line in the middle of the bars here represents correct recognition by chance. As you can see, all emotions were correctly recognized far above chance level. So to summarize, in a series of experiments, I demonstrated that movement characteristics used when expressing a certain emotion in movement enhance that emotion when moving with them and cause the recognition of that emotion when observing movements that include them. Moreover, each emotion has a different and unique set of motor characteristics that is associated with it. This demonstration supports the hypothesized biological mechanism underlying movement-emotion interaction, which I explained in the beginning of my talk. In addition to demonstrating the general theoretical concept, I also provided, using Laban terms, the specific motor characteristics associated with each of the 4 basic emotions: anger, fear, sadness, and happiness. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Shafir. What an exciting presentation and results you showed us. Now for this last talk before the group discussion, I'm glad to introduce Dr. Juan Pablo Kalawski, the organizer of this event. He received his psychology degree from Universidad Central de Chile and a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of North Texas in the US. He pioneered the applications of the Alba Method in psychotherapy. He's a founding member and co-president of the Alba Method Association. He studied emotion-focused therapy. Between 2008 and 2020, he worked at University of Louisville in the US, and his article, Is Tenderness a Basic Emotion?, showed that tenderness is a specific emotion distinct from other basic emotions. He's now a professor of psychology at Universidad Autónoma de Chile in Temuco. His talk is The Alba Method, Applying the Science of the Corporality of Emotions.
Hello, everybody. My name is Juan Pablo Kalawski from the Autonomous University of Chile. I am very happy to be joining this webinar today. So today I'm going to be talking about the Alba Method, which is a method that applies the science of embodied emotions. The method traces its origins back to research done by Susana Bloch and Guy Santibáñez. Their first paper was published in 1973, a long time ago. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what they did and then, you know, the journey from there on. So what Bloch and Santibáñez did in their original study, they started this research in 1970 and it was published in 1973. They used hypnosis to induce emotions in college students and patients with what they called back then anxiety neurosis. Now it would be called something else, some other general kind of anxiety disorder. And what they did was they, induced emotions through hypnosis, and then they measured respiratory activity, cardiac activity, and muscle activity in their participants. They studied 6 emotions that they considered basic emotions, and they were anger, fear, joy, laughter, sadness, and 2 emotions that are not studied as much, eroticism and tenderness. Later, I'm going to go back to these emotions but these 6 emotions were the emotions that they studied. This figure here shows their main finding. This figure is respiratory recording. It's called a pneumograph. And as you can see, each of the emotions has its specific shape. There's a specific pattern to the breathing for each of the emotions. And, like when the recording goes up, that is an inhalation. And when it goes down, it's an exhalation. And as you can see again, there's a particular shape of the breathing for each of the emotions, the 6 emotions that they studied. This, I guess I cannot emphasize it enough. It's really the main thing that distinguishes each of these emotions. So these researchers, they called emotional effector patterns a pattern composed of 3 elements: breathing, posture, and facial expression. So they found that the specific pattern, specific combination of various breathing parameters, especially which all of them together constitute the shape of the breathing cycle, plus body posture, plus facial expression, the 3 of them together could distinguish the 6 emotions that they studied. Now, unlike autonomic changes like heart rate, for example, breathing, posture, and facial behaviors can be willfully controlled. So they are behaviors that we can do at will, or at least, that we can control voluntarily. Therefore, they decided to study what would happen if you actually did perform these patterns at will. So they asked participants to reproduce the respiratory, postural, facial patterns for each emotion without naming the emotion. These were different participants from the ones that they did the original recordings on. And they found that this procedure could activate the rest of the emotional system. That means the subjective experience of each emotion and autonomic changes also, such as heart rate. Now, these findings that they reported in the original studies in Chile were later replicated in France with French participants. And they also found that the configuration, the pattern of breathing, facial expression, and posture could induce the emotional experience itself. Now later, these 2 researchers, they teamed up with Pedro Ortuz, the man we see on the picture. He was a renowned theater director. So why did they do this? They did it because they wanted to use and apply these findings to train actors. They figured that if you could teach these emotional effector patterns to actors, that could improve their ability to express emotions on stage. Now, while they were doing this, they found that the emotions that they induced through the patterns, through the physical patterns, would linger beyond the training sessions. So, for example, an actor would be working on anger, and he would be doing the emotional effector pattern for anger, and then later he would just kind of stay in an angry mood, or maybe even have angry dreams. So what Susanna Bloch and Guy Santibáñez and Pedro Ortuz decided to do was they created a technique that also uses breathing, facial expression, and posture to step out, so to speak, of emotions. The idea was that this procedure, physical procedure, could bring people to a calm but alert state. Now, on the picture, we can see people learning the step out technique. And again, this is not a deep relaxation technique, such as other, like maybe breathing techniques that exist out there. This is a technique to just bring you back to the closest to a non-emotional, neutral state. Now, Susanna Bloch took this whole thing, this whole method of emotional induction, including the 6 emotions and the step-out technique, and she called it Alba emoting. And she has been using this method to train actors and to train other people in various countries. And later, we, many of us who studied with her have used the term Alba Method because emoting can have other connotations, and it's just simpler to call it Alba Method, so we call it the Alba Method. Now, having briefly explained what the Alba Method is, I'm going to now talk about whether this is really consistent with contemporary emotion science. As I explained, the original studies were done in the early 1970s, and so it is important to ask whether it is consistent with what other researchers and more recently have done. So the first question is this question of the list of basic emotions. As I explained, the basic emotions in the Alba Method are anger, fear, sadness, and laughter, joy, plus tenderness and eroticism. Now, as I said, tenderness and eroticism sometimes are not considered emotions, sometimes they're not considered basic emotions. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about why it does make sense to consider these 2 emotions basic emotions. One reason it makes sense is the studies done by Jack Panksepp, who has studied neural circuits, in different mammals, especially rats, but other species of mammals. And he identified 7 emotional circuits that he considers 7 basic emotional systems. And he called them seeking, rage, fear, lust, care, grief, and play. And as you can see on the table I'm showing, they pretty much match the emotions considered basic by Susanna Bloch and in the Alba Method. The exception is that seeking is not included in the Alba Method. Seeking is an enthusiastic kind of excitement kind of emotion that Panksepp considers basic, but is not included in the Alba Method. But the other emotions are included including, excuse the redundance, lust, what he calls lust, which is we call eroticism, and the care system, which is tenderness. It has to do with the caregiving behaviors displayed by mammals when we take care of our children. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about tenderness in particular. So when researchers or emotion experts are asked what is tenderness, there can be really 3 different kind of answers that people give. One kind of answer is that tenderness is just happiness or joy or a positive affect. So that would be feeling good about someone. But really, some people would argue it is just feeling good. Another maybe less common response would be that it is sadness or negative affect. So that is just feeling bad, excuse me, for someone. So the argument would be like, if somebody is hurt or somebody needs help, you feel bad, you feel sad for them. So again, it's really a negative kind of feeling, it's sadness. The third answer, the third possible answer to what is tenderness is the answer that the Alba Method proposes, and that we propose, that tenderness is really a specific, distinct emotion that cannot be reduced to sadness or to happiness. So I did an experiment to test this idea. So what I did was I showed participants two different, well, I actually showed several scenes, but these are the important ones for the purposes of this presentation. Two different scenes, one that I call the Pitiful Scene, that is on the left. And in this scene, there's a cub bear and its mother, and a rock falls on the mother, and the mother dies. And the cub is just trying to check out what's going on, and the mother is dead. Now, just so you know, this is fiction. It comes from a fictional movie called The Bear. So there's no actual bears injured in this scene, but it's a sad, a pitiful scene, right? The other scene was a cute scene, and you can see this guy, nursing a baby otter. You see more of the person, the human, than the otter, but he's holding a baby otter. He's the cutest thing in the world, and that was a cute scene. And my hypothesis is that these two different scenes both would induce tenderness, but they would induce different levels of joy and sadness. And let's see what happened. Well, the purple is how much tenderness people felt. Then green is how much joy people felt, and blue is how much sadness people felt. As you can see, on the left are the responses to the pitiful scene. On the right are the responses to the cute scene. And as you can see, the levels of tenderness were about the same. But what happened is that in one condition, people felt almost no joy and a lot of sadness. And the opposite was true of the cute scene. So what this shows is that tenderness does not co-vary with sadness or with joy. Sadness could be high or low, and joy could be high or low, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the amount of tenderness a person feels. Therefore, this supports the idea that tenderness is a specific emotion. Now we're going to talk about another aspect of the Alba Method, which is the breathing patterns themselves. So these patterns that I showed you early on my presentation, they were originally recorded and described by Susana Bloch and Guy Santibáñez, but it's important to see if other researchers have replicated these findings. Now, there's been various studies on different breathing variables related to emotions. It's not the most common kind of study, but there have been some studies. But it is even rarer to find studies that evaluate the configuration of several variables into a pattern, like Susana Bloch and Guy Santibáñez did in their research. So, and also Susana kind of like study this and measure these patterns again in Europe after she moved to Europe in the early 90s. But I have found 3 studies that have partially replicated what Susanna found. One study by Filippelli and colleagues, another study by Philippot, Chappelle, and Blairy, and another one by Kriebig, Wilhelm, Roth, and Gross. And they did not study all the same emotions that Susanna Bloch studied. Filippelli studied laughter, and he found a configuration that was quite similar to the pattern described by Susanna Bloch. Philippot and his colleagues studied fear, anger, and sadness. And for sadness, the pattern was similar but not the same as the pattern described by Susanna Bloch and her colleagues. And they found similar patterns for fear and anger. And finally, Kriebig and colleagues also found a similar pattern for fear. So we found that other researchers have replicated parts of these findings. Now, as you can see, tenderness and sadness have not been studied like this. So we do not have replication information for these 2 emotions. I said tenderness and sadness, and I really meant tenderness and eroticism, which, as I said before, they are not studied as often by researchers, because many people don't even consider them emotions, right? Okay, so now the main hypothesis is that reproducing this breathing pattern specifically can induce emotional experience. Now, there's other studies about posture and about face, but the thing that is unique about the Alba method is the breathing patterns. And the idea, as I explained, is that you breathe in a specific way and you feel then the emotion. I guess one thing I would like to say before I talk about what's on this slide is that we're not talking about just like, for example, if you do the laughter pattern and you feel maybe a little good. No, you actually feel laughter. Like the experience is that you're laughing as if something super funny had happened, but there's nothing funny. It's just your breathing. The same with sadness or anger. You feel furious. You really feel it, but there's no stimulus. It's just through the breathing. Now, this has been my own personal experience practicing this method, but it's also important to evaluate it scientifically. So that's why it's important that this is replicated. So Philippot and his colleagues did this, and they specifically asked participants to reproduce the breathing patterns that they had previously identified for joy, fear, anger, and sadness. Again, they left out eroticism and tenderness. And they found in their study that the patterns of joy, anger, and sadness induced the corresponding emotions, and the fear pattern induced fear and anger. So that is the one replication by independent researchers. Now I'm going to talk about the applications of the Alba method and applying it specifically to develop emotional intelligence. This is a study that my colleagues and I conducted, and it is in preparation. We haven't submitted it to publication at this point. What we did, we compared 34 acting students taking Alba method courses with 28 acting students taking non-Alba courses. So they were all acting students, as you know, and as I explained earlier, the Alba method is used to to train actors. So some actors took the Alba classes, and other actors took the non-Alba classes. And everybody, when I said actors, I really mean acting students, right? And everybody took a test before and after the courses. And the test measured the ability to perceive emotions. And I'm going to show you a couple of sample items from the test that we created. This is a sample item from this test. This is a picture, and the person taking the test had to select which emotion is expressed in this picture. And the options were sadness, surprise, anger, fear, and disgust. Then another item in this measure was this other, is instead of just the face, this is everything but the face, it's the rest of the body. And again, there are 5 options, and the person had to pick which emotion is being expressed in this picture. So this is what we found. The purple line represents the people taking the Alba classes, and the blue line represents the people taking the non-Alba classes. There was no significant difference between the two groups at the beginning, and there was a difference at the end. And as you can see, everybody started at a relatively high level of recognition. Like there were 16 items in this test, and the mean at the beginning was around 11, and there was a significant increase for the people taking the Alba class. So they improved in their ability to recognize emotions after taking this course. Another thing that we are exploring is the step out, just the step out, which is again this technique to bring people back to a neutral, non-emotional, alert but relaxed state. So Anna Robinson and I have been applying this technique with people on the autism spectrum, and specifically she ran a group for 7 young adults with autism, and this was an emotion-focused therapy group that included the step-out technique. And we asked people about their experiences with the technique. So this was like a qualitative study of like just what people's reactions are. And this is the analysis of the verbal responses that people gave. Now you can see that the total is more than 7. There were 7 participants because people said more than one kind of answer or response to being asked how they felt during the exercise. And now the one that I personally did not expect was a cooling sensation that 4 people experienced some kind of a cooling sensation during the exercise. And it makes sense because it kind of like most of the time brings down your heart rate, and it just makes a lot of sense, but I didn't expect people would report this. The other common response was a calming and relaxing feeling, which is exactly what we expected. Now, 2 people couldn't tell how they felt. 1 person felt overwhelmed, and 2 people expressed heightened body awareness. 1 person experienced pain relief. 2 people expressed feeling peaceful, and 2 people expressed feeling connected, relational connection. So again, this is something we're exploring, how people respond to the step out technique, specifically people on the autism spectrum in this case. My favorite quote from this group is one person who said, "I know what you mean by neutral. It is a latent feeling most of the time, and I don't feel anything at all, which is good." I thought it was great because, yes, that's exactly the idea of the step-out technique. Is not feeling, is not trying to induce an emotion, it's trying to step out of emotions and not feeling emotions or reducing emotional arousal. And this is a good thing. Sometimes we just need to come back to neutral, reset. Now, I'd like to talk to, at the end of this presentation about applying the Alba method in psychotherapy. And I put the tagline, "It's complicated," because it really is. And it could be, people could get the idea that this could be a very easy thing to apply in therapy and be obviously therapeutic, but it's really a little bit more complicated than people might think. So let me talk a little bit about that. I say, people say, can't we just produce the emotions we want? So we have this tool that we can induce emotions, the 6 basic emotions, and can we just use it and just say, now I want to be happy, and I'm just gonna be happy, and just do it like that. And my answer to that is, in a training workshop and on stage, yes, that is what the method is for. You can actually call forth the emotion that you want. But in real life, emotions are rapid, automatic reactions to nuanced situations, and we cannot and should not try to rationally decide in advance which emotions are going to work best in which situations. In other words, emotions are an evolved system that gives us rapid responses to situations, and it doesn't really make sense to try to determine with our neocortex which is the best emotion and try to force it into the situation. So what is the use of Alba in therapy? I'm a clinical psychologist. That is something that I've been doing, applying the Alba method in therapy. So how do I do it? The main application, I think, is that the Alba method is useful for therapist training. Alba improves the therapist's ability to perceive the client's emotions, and it improves our awareness of our own emotions as therapists. This really is the main advantage of the Alba method. Not the only one, but I think it is by far the most important, that we can have this tool to recognize emotions through our bodies, through the other person's bodies, and it improves our awareness, just like I showed in the previous in the study where we compared students taking the Alba classes to students taking a different kind of class. Also, there are benefits of teaching the Alba method to clients. First, step out can be taught to help regulate overwhelming emotions, just like we've been exploring with people on the autism spectrum. Also, the Alba training can help clients increase their emotional awareness. So just like it's good for our emotional awareness as therapists, it is good for emotional awareness of clients, to better be able to distinguish sadness from anger, for example, or when they feel different emotions. Now, this picture here is of a recent paper about memory reconsolidation and emotions and psychotherapy. And it was written by Lane, Ryan, Nadel, I think, and Greenberg. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about this theory to present a framework for how the Alba method can be applied in therapy. These authors propose that lived experiences become recorded into an integrated memory structure. And these structures integrate emotion, cognition, and action. Now, what they propose is that when these structures are active, they can be modified by new experience. Therefore, they can be reconsolidated. That's what that means. So if you have like a painful emotional experience in response to an event, you can recall this experience, and that provides an opportunity to actually change the experience, including changing the emotion associated with the experience. Also, Leslie Greenberg proposed a model of emotion transformation. He was one of the authors of the previous study, or the previous paper, and he proposed that if you activate two different emotions together, you can create a synthesis, of a new kind of emotional experience. For example, if you activate a maladaptive, trauma-based fear together with a sense of self-compassion, these two emotions, these two feelings really can be merged into a new synthesis of maybe self-worth, or self-forgiveness, for example, or confidence. So probably confidence it's a better name for a kind of synthesis between fear and self-compassion. Like then you come out with this sense of that I can be okay. So based on this framework, then there's other uses for the Alba method or other methods to induce emotions, because what Alba does is induce emotions. So we can use the emotional effector patterns to activate maladaptive emotion cognition structures so that we can change them. We can also use the patterns to evoke alternative adaptive emotions. So these are now more advanced ways to use the patterns in therapy based on this theory of memory reconsolidation and emotional transformation. Now, again, I still think the main usefulness of the patterns and the Alba method is for us therapists to help us be more aware of our own emotions and our clients' emotions. So now I'm reaching the end of my presentation, and the question is, how can I learn the Alba method? And the first thing I would like to say is that to really learn the Alba method, it has to be done in person. We cannot do a Zoom class because it's very technical, and it involves breathing, posture, and it's important for the trainer to be able to hear your breathing, to look at different parts of your body and how they're tensing or relaxing. And so it's important to do it in person with an experienced instructor. And how to find experienced instructors, you can do it through the Alba Method Association, and the website for our association is there. That is the end of my presentation. I know that we are not live right now, so you cannot ask me questions at this moment, but I know we're gonna all participate in the roundtable, and I look forward to talking about this with everybody at the roundtable. Thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalawski, for your presentation. It was a great pleasure to hear it. And now let's go to our next session, the group discussion or virtual roundtable. It was a real pleasure to hear all your talks. I'm really happy that you stay with us for a bit more time and have this conversation. So we feel free to express your ideas and please answer some of these questions. It's a pleasure to have again Dr. Heini Saarimäki, Dr. Tal Shafir, and Dr. Juan Pablo Kalawski. So welcome to this roundtable or this virtual conversation session.
Our pleasure, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
It's amazing how much does our emotions change our body. When I saw the images, the brain images, I thought the full nervous system goes along the entire body. Could these messages from the brain trigger some neurons along the body and their muscles reply? Okay.
I think it's a great question. And I think it's one of the keys that happens during the emotional state. So I think the role of emotions is somehow to target our behavior and all our actions to properly function in the environment and face the challenges that we have. So the current emotion, as I see it, is just the state of the central nervous system at a given moment, and it will guide all our actions and move our body basically as well.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of times people who are not like emotion researchers, who like just have emotions, have this idea that emotions, you just feel your emotion inside and that's it. And what science says about emotions is that emotions, just like Heini said, are ways to deal with the world. So it makes sense that our bodies have to be prepared to meet the challenges of the world. Emotion does for us.
Okay. Well, usually emotions, they can come by themselves, right? They don't appear alone. I mean, when you're in love, probably you can also feel happy or sad at the same time. When you're angry, you might experience some disgust or others. How can you isolate these emotions during your study? Or the response people get at different stimuli are unique to one emotion?
I can answer that one. In science, we have to work very clean, in a very clean way and clear way. Otherwise, if there are two emotions, we don't know if the results relate to one emotion or to the other emotion or only to both of them together. So when we design the experiments, we, on purpose, design it to make it for each emotion separately. Now, of course, in real life, it's not always like that. And then, because real life are more complex than the experiments that we do, but this is how we have to start. And then once we understand and know what happened in each emotion by itself, then we can try and create experiments for several emotions together. So that's why we did our experiments usually with one emotion at a time, or with basic emotions, each one separate. But I can say also that in terms of the movement, like in my experiments, we found the motor characteristics that characterize a specific emotion. If you have a complex emotion, you have the motor characteristics of two emotions together. You'll see them in the movement that is not completely angry, or maybe there will be a little bit of anger and a little bit of sad, or something like that. A little bit of anger and a little bit of fear. So you'll see some combination of that, and that will also be expressed in the movement that you'll see.
I agree with Tal. I think when we are designing the experiments, we try to target the stimuli, for instance, for eliciting different emotional states very specifically to that specific emotion, and then that is the way to isolate it. And also, we usually use pretty short stimuli and measure pretty short responses, like tens of seconds, where it's thought that usually the emotional state sort of stays the same. But on the other hand, I think in the recent years, also the field of emotions has moved to more like naturalistic stimuli. For instance, using continuous, like full movies, and trying to extract the emotional content from those. And there, I think it becomes pretty tricky because you cannot really isolate the emotion. So I completely agree with Tal that we should first know the ingredients for the isolated controlled situations before we can move on to study emotions in more naturalistic contexts.
And I want to add something in terms of applications of these findings, because the Alba I presented, it's really an applied method that is based on science, but it's applied. So the main application, I mean, I'm a psychologist and I've used it in therapy, but the original application was in theater, and it's still being used to train actors. And so what the Alba method does is that they have these 6 basic emotions, and each of them have a specific breathing pattern, facial expression, and posture. But then in more advanced training, you can train actors to express mixed emotions. So they can do like inhalation in one pattern and exhalation in a different pattern, or a expression that it belongs to anger, and the posture that belongs to eroticism, for example. So that's something that is very fun, really, for actors to mix and match all these different emotions to create like the specific combination that scene requires.
Amy, you mentioned something that brought my attention to this little point. You said we do very short stimuli and measure it very quickly. I mean, in short periods of time. Sorry. Why is that? How can this affect?
Well, at least for the brain imaging studies, I'm mostly doing those. It's usually, we are limited with the scanning time. We cannot ask people to lie in the fMRI scanner for hours. So we kind of have to squeeze in, especially in research where we are interested in multiple emotions. We want to squeeze in a lot of emotions during a short scanning time. And this, of course, creates additional problems, because the emotion that you just elicited with a movie, it can have lingering effects of up to minutes afterwards, and it can also affect the next emotion that we try to elicit. But there are techniques for overcoming this. But getting pure emotions out, I would say, is fairly difficult. And also, we don't really know what we are eliciting necessarily at that time in that particular individual. So even oftentimes, especially in the past, we just pick the stimuli according to what the researcher thinks. So if I just define this is what I think is a prototypical episode of anger or fear, and this should elicit approximately the same response in everybody. But I think in the recent few years, more attention has been brought to the individual variation, also in emotion elicitation. And I think we have now new methods also for measuring individual variation in the responses.
Okay.
I don't know if this, yeah, sorry. I would like to ask maybe Tal and Juan Pablo, have you noticed the have you measured or noticed the individual variation in your studies regarding, for instance, movements or breathing patterns?
In terms of my studies, the different, I'm looking at different motor characteristics and different combinations of them. So some people will feel the emotion more with one motor characteristic than another one with another one, or in a certain combination, one person will feel more than other. And the other thing that we did is we actually gave them the motor characteristics after we found them from previous motor expressions, and then we asked them to move their own movement. So they can choose whatever they feel that the movement is comfortable for them, because everybody has a little bit of different way of moving. So the example I gave in my presentation, that you can use the motor characteristic of advanced, direct, and strong, and you can kick or give a box, or and then you do it in many different things, or just point like that, which is also like dancing and direct and strong. So these are different ways of expressing something similar, and different people express it a little bit differently in whatever movement that they feel authentic. but using the same motor characteristics. So in that way, we actually gave option for individual differences.
In my case, I haven't done research on individual differences in emotional expression. So most of what I can say is about like the application of the teaching of these patterns that I talked about. And usually there's like a first phase when the person is learning it is that it's very mechanical. That's the word we use, you know, like, and the person is really focused on trying to get the specifics right, because it's not that easy to get the breathing for many people, just to do the breathing right. And then after this robotic phase, there's a moment when it clicks and it kind of triggers the spontaneous emotion in the person, and then the person makes it their own. And so you can but we haven't, or at least I haven't really, you know, like measured individual differences, but you can see this is this person's laughter, but it is also laughter. So you can see there is the you know, the laughter as a universal thing, but also it's the way this person laughed, and it looks genuine. So that's really the important thing, again, for theater, because it doesn't work if you just make a face, you know, it has to look real, otherwise it just doesn't work for acting.
Yeah, definitely. Our face is only one part. And you showed it in the videos. I mean, we saw it different times, especially in Tal presentation. I want to make another question about this, because the emotions, I mean, we all are human beings and share emotions and some facial expressions that are common. But in different cultures, for example, pride might be a virtue, like in the US, for example, but in different, it can mean something completely different for an Indian monk, where pride is not seen as a virtue. So the same for anger. But my question is, does the culture affect the connections between our brains and how we perceive these emotions?
I think so. I think that's the valence, which is the sort of positivity or negativity of the emotion. I think it can be evaluated at different phases of the emotion episode, and one of the ways we evaluate is by labeling. Maybe when we feel, for instance, anger, we might label it as a negative emotion because of our environment, where we are sort of maybe taught that showing expressions of anger are not okay. So I think it's the positive, negative aspect, the valence aspect of emotion. I think it has been considered a very somehow stable construct in emotion theory in the past, but I think it is actually not so well defined, because, for instance, emotions like pride and anger don't necessarily have like they are not good or bad. There's nothing wrong with the emotions. They serve a function in our life. They help us in many ways. So there's nothing wrong. But we still during our upbringing, we learn to associate them as negative or positive. And this, I think, is exactly the culture that makes it happen. But I think you can also see differences in the brain activity. So also the evaluation process, I think, must be sort of formed during development. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, for as a therapist, it's really important to kind of like have this view that all emotions serve a purpose. Often people come to therapy wanting to get rid of emotions that they don't like, and we need to evaluate, you know, what function it's serving, and yes, you know, often maybe person needs to go through a process of emotion transformation, but there's no, like, anger, you know, can be adaptive, can be useful sometimes, or sadness, you know. And people, like in Chile in particular, people are often scared of emotions that they consider negative. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that a long time ago, I was doing an experiment that, anyway, I didn't talk about it in my presentation, but I was using the breathing pattern of tenderness to induce tenderness. And that is an emotion that males are not very used to expressing and feeling. So I had one session with one participant that I gave him the instructions, and then after a while you could see that he was getting into the emotion of tenderness, and afterwards he was mad at me. He was angry because I made him feel this emotion that he didn't want to feel, and so there's a gender component there too.
Tal, any comments on this?
I have two things in mind. One is, I think that the cultural differences also affect how we perceive the bodily expression. So, for example, if somebody sends and look you in the eyes, in Western culture, that means that I'm interested in that person, and I'm looking at his eyes and I'm interested in him. But in some other cultures, for example, you have to, if you respect that person, you actually put your eyes down and don't look at the eyes, because looking at the eyes, it's kind of like not a nice thing to do, not a respectful thing to do. So, and I'm wondering if you are talking about the actual emotion or the expression and how we perceive the emotion from other person, and according to the one culture or another. So there are different things there, and that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing, I don't know if that's the right place to say it, but I just wanted to mention, Juan Pablo mentioned the person who didn't like feeling tenderness, and he was angry at him making him feeling tenderness because he preferred not to feel that, and right. And that's kind of like repressing his tenderness. And I wanted right. to, and maybe you should clarify more the difference between repressing emotions and right. feeling neutral that you mentioned in your presentation. So maybe that place to clarify that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Tal. Yeah, that's important. That's something that I didn't really explain in the presentation, and it's very important because the step out technique that I talked about is a technique to calm down emotional arousal, whatever it may be. Now, it's not magic, and of course, if there's a lion running at you, it's not gonna work. But it really, it's a physical process to actually reduce arousal, which is different from repressing. And a lot of people repress emotions, and often they do that, and I don't know what if you want to say something about that, Tal, by tensing the body. And so it's like an armor that people, do physically to avoid certain feelings that for whatever reason they don't want to feel.
Sometimes it can be tensing, and sometimes it's actually avoiding the physical expression of that. So there are some women, for example, who feel that they should express anger, and you will not see them pressing. They will actually be more like in a sad. They will kind of let go in order not to show and express anger.
Yeah, and in the theory or the approach that I use for therapy, that I try to incorporate this in, is emotion-focused therapy, and there, they make the distinction between primary emotions and secondary emotions. And secondary emotions are often defensive emotions that people can talk, and often there's people feel anger, and then they feel sadness on top of that anger, or the other way around.
You mentioned something very interesting there, and in the talks also was that this difference between gender is something genetic, is something cultural. How can you say? Because the lights on the MRI were in different parts for different emotions, for the same emotions. So, what's the difference between males and females?
Right. In brain imaging, like in the past, there have been some results regarding gender differences during emotional processing. So that eliciting a specific emotion results in different activity in women's and men's brains. But I think there are also studies showing that in case you measure what actual emotion you are eliciting in the person, then that is already, the felt emotion is different between men and women, and that causes the differences also in the brain activity, or explains them. So this refers to what I mentioned before, that in the past we just used a specific stimulus, and the researcher expected it to elicit the exact same emotion in everyone, also in both genders, and when we actually measured what emotion was felt, then the gender differences were not there anymore.
Sure, Juan Pablo, I'm going to ask you on the applied side.
Yes, on that comment, on that response, that, you know, I think it was you, Heini, that you talked, and maybe Tal too, about like what an emotion is, and how like there's many different theories, and often there's lots of disagreement between scholars. But one thing that it seems to be like a consensus is that emotions are multi-component, and they include many different aspects. And I think really what we're studying is how these components relate to each other. And always there's going to be a tension between things that go together and things that don't go together, you know. And I think culture can be something that can pull some elements away from the core, maybe innate emotional responses. I don't know if that makes sense to Tal and Heini, that way of thinking about it.
Well, I think that there are brain differences between males and females, and we know that. So I think part of the difference in emotion expression, or whatever you're asking about, is because of that, and part is the individual difference. So, and then when you talk about innate, I don't know, maybe, and part the individual, and part is cultural. So I can give an example, that this movement, yeah. So for men, it's usually happy, you know, oh, we won the football game, yeah. But for women, this is kind of more like an anger movement, because it's strong and it's direct, and it's, so, and I found some differences like that in the movements that I did, and this might be cultural, and it might be that in general males are more tend to do more strong movements, and it's more natural for them. And when they go, they fight, and that's like in fighting, that's they have to have that in order to go and win, and you know it's part of that. And women were like originally they were back at home in the cave, and they were more tender and more, you know, they used more different type of movements. So for them, maybe happiness will be expressed in a different way, slightly different ways, because on their everyday, they move a little bit different. So I think it's part culturally, part innate. And I can say, for example, for happiness, rotating and turning around yourself, we can see that much more in women and much less in men. Again, I don't know if this is cultural or what, but women used to dance more, and that's maybe more of a dance way of expressing happiness. So I don't know. So,
yeah, I would like to say something about that, but I don't know if Heini wanted to had something to say.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe of the question regarding culture and innateness. That is something we can't really tell, because the brain just keeps on changing all the time, and it's molded by the culture. So yeah.
And this is, you know, something that we're not gonna respond here in this 30-minute conversation, you know, but it's one of the big controversies in psychology in general, and in emotion research in particular, you know, like to what extent these things are part of our, you know, genetic makeup and to what extent they are learned, and there's different positions on that. I wanted to respond to this movement that Tal was talking about, and it makes me think that there's, one thing is that in the field of emotions, one thing that research is lagging behind, but there's good efforts being done, right? But it is this differentiation between different positive, quote unquote, or pleasant emotions. For a long time there was happiness, and people talked about happiness, but I think it is really important to start distinguishing different kinds of happiness. Like, for example, tenderness, it is different from amusement. They both feel positive, but they are really different. Or pride also, which is not in the Alba method, but I do think it's an important emotion. And that brings me to Heini's comparison between pride and anger, because there's important differences between the two, but they are also similar. So I think they have things in common, those two emotions. I don't know if you want to maybe tell us more about that.
Yeah. So I guess I was only talking about the bodily patterns, and I think the most important similarity was maybe in the posture, where both are sort of expansive and sort of orienting, facing, not fleeing away. But I'm sure there are also differences and similarities in other components between them, but we are about to explore that in detail.
Cool.
All you mentioned here is very interesting, and you were mentioning something I really wanted to ask. I know it's probably not going to be solved now, but it was very nice to see how the movement triggered a more pronounced response to an emotion. But can age, as we age, or a different culture affect how the emotions are triggered? Open for anyone who can comment.
Maybe I can start. I think that one of the most well-established effects of age is that when you get older, you have the positivity bias, which means that you tend to evaluate situations as more positive and attend to positive emotions more than to negative ones.
Mm.
That's very interesting. Tal, maybe you want to comment on this? How emotions are triggered?
Yeah, I agree with the positivity bias. I know about the positivity bias. I don't know if it's in terms of triggering the emotions, or it's some kind of, when you get older, you just want to see more the positive things, rather than it's kind of a choice. Not always very conscious, but it's kind of a choice. In terms of really triggering, I think what triggers our emotion changes over time based on life experience. So I think that's one part, that maybe some things that might have made you angry when you're young, or when you become older, never mind, you don't become angry because of them anymore. You're wiser. It's not worth becoming angry about it, for example. That's one thing. The other thing is in terms of perceiving emotions. So one thing is the positivity bias, and the other thing is because they have found that the ability to accurately perceive emotions from facial expression and bodily movement increases. And I think that's part because people themselves use their body less and use their facial expression less. And so that is more difficult. Because more we move in a certain way and we know what we feel when we move that, the more we will be able to identify that when we see it in another person.
Right.
So I think that's part of what in relation to emotion perception, or emotion recognition in the body.
Yeah.
Juan Pablo, you want to mention something? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a skill that we develop, like they not necessarily, I mean, the just like Tal said, what triggers an emotion can change, but the recognition is a skill that, the experience can help us develop, and we can get better at it just by interacting and feeling our own emotions, or through more like targeted training.
You also mentioned, Juan Pablo, before that there were primary and secondary emotions. Why, or maybe this can be linked to this, why some emotions are more deeply linked with some movements?
Okay, well, there's a different concepts, like, and the word primary and secondary can mean different things in different contexts. So in terms of therapy, we talk about primary emotions as being emotion that is more immediately felt, and secondary emotion is the emotion that comes next. So often we are not aware of the first emotion we feel, and we feel the next emotion. So for example, most of us don't like feeling shame, and often we can feel shame, and then the next second we're feeling angry, but really underneath that there is shame. So that's kind of like the concept of primary and secondary for therapy purposes. Different authors use different, terms. But you were talking about, the connection between movements and emotions, and maybe Heini and Tal can talk about this too. I think it has to do with evolution. I think it has to do, for example, anger involves, has to do with the, evolutionary need to remove obstacles, for example, to defend territory, defend, what is yours, and that necessitates specific, very forceful actions. So it just makes sense that this would be connected. But probably Tal and Heini can say more about that.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that I wonder is the sort of, again, regarding the concepts that we use for different emotions, whether these are actually overlapping, and to what extent. For instance, for anger, it's sort of an everyday word that we use, and it usually describes the sort of psychological part of the emotion, what we sort of feel and what we can label. But then if we consider the behavior that is usually associated with anger, that's like aggression, and that's not necessarily always the same thing, in my opinion. But yeah, I think we would need to be, that is what emotion research kind of needs. It needs some criteria for what we consider different concepts to mean. And yeah, I think there's sometimes confusion regarding this as well. Are we talking about sort of the behavior? Are we talking about the interoception, how I feel in my body, or is it the concept, or what is it that we are talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of the primary versus secondary, there are different ways of defining that, but I think one of the ways is that the primary are the emotions that also animals feel. And I think we have some of the processes that go inside our brain for these primary emotions are kind of similar to what happens in the animal kingdom. And so these associations and these movements that we tend to do are so strongly within our brain, innate, that maybe, I mean, in terms of maybe the movements are more clear because of that, because it tends to be more similar across different people, I think. I don't know, but
I think that's the difference.
More culture.
Yeah, I think that there's a difference that also it's controversial, right? That people make between basic and non-basic. And Heini, I think you were talking about basic emotions and social emotions. You know, and sometimes people call basic emotions primary, but in terms of, again, therapy, primary could be basic or could be non-basic. It doesn't mean one way or the other. Like it could be that, for example, your primary emotion is anger, and then the secondary is sadness, but both of them are basic emotions, or it could be the other way around. But also, I don't know, you know, personally, I think, you know, I see a movement in the field of expanding the concept of basic emotions, you know, and there was, for many years, there was this idea that there were 6 basic emotions, and that's it. And I think, you know, we're starting to find out it's much more complicated than that, you know, and there's like, it's more like you know, well, the more we find out, the more complicated it gets.
I want to ask a last question. Since Tal is in Israel now, Heini in Finland, Juan Pablo in Chile, and you do different research, I mean, related to brain and emotions and movement, and applied and in therapy, how to apply this knowledge. How are these connected? How you can connect all your research to improve the knowledge, the field, and the community, of course. It's a tough one. Let's start with Heini.
Yeah.
Make papers of each other.
Yes, I think we all noticed in our presentations we had a lot of overlap, which was really nice to see, because the same themes sort of came up in different contexts. And for instance, in my work, where I have developed the coding system for different emotional body sensations and behaviors, I've used Tal's previous work regarding movements as one inspiration for how to specify different emotion-related features from the body. And then I think all of this, all the knowledge that we have for movement and what the brain does, all of this informs also the therapy. And I think in Juan Pablo's presentation we saw really nicely how it all comes together. A lot of the sort of conceptual frameworks that Juan Pablo showed were overlapping with mine. For instance, how the emotion, the feeling arises of different components, for instance, autonomous nervous system like breathing and then the bodily changes and movements. And I think all of this knowledge that we have from behavior, movements, and the brain can be used in therapy and applied. Yes.
Tal?
Yeah, as I said before, I think we read each other's research. I mean, this is what we do in academia, at least, and then the people of us that are also doing therapy also read that and then try to think how to apply it. Right. And I have a paper in which because I do both, I actually wrote a paper about how to apply the findings of my research. So that's what happens. We just we know about each other.
Right.
Juan Pablo?
And there was something that I wanted to say. I forgot what that was. Let's see if it comes to my mind later. But you can go ahead and say something else when I remember. If I remember, I'll say it.
No problem. Okay, so I'll give you just a minute for you to say bye to people who have listened to your talks, like a message you want to give to the public after this conversation session. Tal, you want to start?
No, I have to think about the message.
A message for the audience, for people who probably are not neuroscientists or not people working with emotions. That something you want to mention about the research and how it impacts the world.
I have a message which is actually in my TED Talk, which is through the body we can really affect our mood. And so, as I said in my talk, I said Nike says that just do it, and I say just dance it. And I really, go dancing, enjoy yourself, and even dance at home by yourself, and you'll just feel better.
Good advice. I'll do it at home. COVID is still here, so stay safe. Heini.
Yeah, thank you. I thank everyone for listening to the talks, and I have definitely learned a lot by listening to the talks of Tal and Juan Pablo, and also from this discussion. So I hope it has been also useful for other people. Maybe from my talk, if I need to highlight something, maybe one useful concept that I've found really useful to apply in just everyday life is the concept of the emotion process and how it comes about. When I talk about in my talk that there's something external or internal that triggers an evaluation process in us, and then that leads to different changes in different components, and then we feel a conscious emotion. So understanding how this process works for different emotions, I think is very helpful in also to helping you to deep dive into your own emotions and to understand better why you are feeling how you are feeling, and also how you can affect your own emotions.
Thank you. Juan Pablo, last word?
Yeah, I think, similar to what Heini and Tal said, I think really there's many messages, right? But one of them is really reaffirm, as I see it, what William James said over 100 years ago, that emotions are felt in the body, and an emotion includes a bodily feeling. And so if you want to work with emotions, you have to work with the body. If you want to understand your emotions, you have to pay attention to your body. You cannot just do it all up here and think your way out of your emotions. You need to feel them in your body. I think that's very important. So if you're struggling with stress or more like applied, or psychological issues, pay attention to your body. Pay attention to what's happening in your body. It's going to give you some information that you will not have if you just try to think about it, with thoughts.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks Juan Pablo again, because he wanted to do this seminar. So thanks to you to organize this. I really appreciate the talks you gave, Dr. Shafir, Dr. Saarimäki, and Dr. Kalawski. It was really nice to hear you. It was really nice to have this conversation session. And I hope you all enjoyed what you see. And we all definitely learned a lot about the emotions and our behavior. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your attention and hope that this seminar has helped you to better understand how our brain affects our emotions and vice versa, and how our actions and movements also affect our emotions and brain activity. We welcome your comments and invite you to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more scientific information and become part of our community. See you in our next seminar.